Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Coast to Coast Hockey. Today, we'll be talking about everything to do with the Tampa Bay Lightning. I'm Cameron.
I'm Noel.
And I'm Nick.
Let's get into it.
Looking at the offseason additions that the Lightning made this year, they brought in Connor Sheary, Tyler Mott, and Glenn Denning, more on those guys later, as well as depth pieces Calvin DeHaan, Jonas Johansson from Colorado, Logan Brown, and Austin Watson on a PTO.
On the subtractions front, Alex Killorn left for Anaheim, Ross Colton is now in Colorado, Corey Perry is now in Chicago, and among other depth pieces have now left the team as well with their cap constraints.
Taking a look at some of the biggest additions that the Lightning made this offseason, the first one we're going to look at is Connor Sheary. And the interesting thing about this guy is this is the only player that Tampa made a long-term commitment to this offseason, signing him to a 3-year deal that carries an average annual value of $2 million. This is a player who won 2 Stanley Cups with the Pittsburgh Penguins and at times played on a line with Sidney Crosby. So he's got that championship pedigree and the ability to play with really good players. So he'll fit in nicely in this top nine. He had 37 points last year and 43 points the year before. And he has career highs of 23 goals and 53 points. So pretty good offensive player to add into the mix here in Tampa.
Tyler Mott has been a journeyman around the league. He has most recently played for Vancouver, Ottawa, and the Rangers, and signed a 1-year, $800K off-season deal with the Lightning here. He's somewhat of a smaller forward, standing at 5'10", 192 pounds, but is a very good fourth line player. He has lots of energy out there on the ice, plays a somewhat physical game even for his size, and is very good defensively and on the penalty kill. And his offense is there too. You can't be don't want to take that for granted too. So he's a very good fourth line player.
The third acquisition of note is Luke Glendening. This is a guy who was almost a career Detroit Red Wing before moving to Dallas for 2 years. In the most recent 2 years, he's put up 6 points in 70 games last year, and before that, 16 in 82. So not the most offensive option, but he does win a lot of faceoffs. Specifically, if you look at last year's faceoff winners with more than 300 faceoffs taken, Luke Glendening is ranked 8th in the league at 59.1%. He's among the likes of Jonathan Toews, Jamie Benn, Ryan Johansson, and Jeff Carter for that sake, as well as Claude Giroux and Tavares. So he's up there with the greats in the faceoff category. So that's what he'll be primarily used for as a centerman. He also provides some defense, being in the top third in the league, probably for defensive statistically, but this is a guy who will provide minimal offense in the long run.
Moving on to the future outlook for the Tampa Bay Lightning. This is a team that's been all in for the past few seasons and as such doesn't really have the deepest prospect pool. Some guys of note are Ethan Gauthier, Dylan Duke, and Isaac Howard, who may have lost a little favor with scouts over recent years, but at the bare minimum was one of the most stylish guys at the most recent NHL drafts in recent memory. And then a goaltending prospect in Hugo Anafelt as well there too.
And as Cam mentioned, they have been all in for most recent years, so they will be lacking some draft capital as well. And most notably, they are missing picks from that Tanner Jeannot trade, where they traded picks 1 through 5 to acquire him at last year's deadline. So the draft capital is a bit lackluster.
On to the prospect spotlight for the Tampa Bay Lightning. The three prospects we're going to note today are Ethan Gauthier, Dylan Duke, and Isaac Howard. The first prospect of note is Ethan Gauthier. He was drafted in the most recent draft, 37th overall in the second round, and this is a guy who I'm very fond of as a facilitator and playmaker. He is quite the opportunistic fella in the QMJH show, where he's playing alongside some good pieces like Joshua Roy in Sherbrooke last year. But at the same time, he is one of those guys that will be in the middle of the lineup all the time, in the middle of the ice, all the time, and ready to play alongside the top guys and sort of dish the puck off to either of them or play alongside them and protect them as well in this certain areas. So he's a guy that I look out for to be a solid pro transition player, where he can provide any type of player with the skill and opportunity that they need to help them get along. The second prospect of note is Dylan Duke. This is a player who's currently playing with Michigan in college right now, and he should be going into his third year of college next year, as he was drafted in the fourth round in 2021 at 126th. This is a guy who has definitely blossomed into what the prospect they were hoping him to be when they drafted him after a pretty, average time with the U.S. national team. He put up 49 points in 50 games in his last year with the U18 national team, which is something that is good as a number, but many players are putting up way more than a point a game or double the points per game that he is putting up at that point, hence why he was drafted so late. But now, as he transitions into college, he's playing on a great team at the University of Michigan, and he should be looking forward to his third year in college. The third prospect of note is Isaac Howard, and this is, as Cameron mentioned, quite a flashy player on and off the ice. He is meant to be all of speed, and this is a guy who is just fast, breaks down the offenses, breaks down the defenses, this is a guy who's all over the ice despite being a winger. I think he's going to be a great puck stealer in the future if he continues his trajectory. As you can see, there very little offensive production in NCAA action. I am curious to see as he changes schools to Michigan State University from the University of Minnesota Duluth. I'll be interested to see how he does this following year.
Moving on to the projected lineups for the Tampa Bay Lightning headed into this coming season. The forward group is similar to what it's been in past years, with some notable subtractions like Alex Killorn and the entire fourth line from last season. But that first line is the one we've come to know for the Tampa Bay Lightning, with Steven Stamkos, Braden Point, and Nikita Kucherov. Got to be one of the best first lines in the NHL. Just the pedigree, the experience, and the high offensive upside of that line. The second line there is Brandon Hagel, Anthony Cirelli, and Connor Sheary. A really solid second line. They just extended Hagel to a long-term deal, and Cirelli is one of the best two-way centers in the NHL at this point in time. Connor Sheary, we've already touched on, will fit in nicely on that second line as well. And then we got Michael Eyssimont, Nick Paul, and Tanner Jeannot on that third line. Eyssimont, I believe, is a good defensive forward as well, too. Nick Paul, we've seen have flashes of offensive greatness at times in the playoffs. Rugged center at times as well. He's a big guy, so he's a great guy to have on your third line there. And Tanner Jeannot is one of the heavyweights in the NHL at this point in time, one of the best fighters in the NHL, and a guy who put up 20 goals in his rookie season. So that's why they gave up so many picks to get him at last year's deadline. They're really hoping he's a guy who can burst for them offensively, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him move into that top six later on in the season based on how much they gave up to get him. And then a really solid fourth line with Tyler Mott, Luke Glendening, and Austin Watson. This is assuming that they do sign Austin Watson, considering he's on a PTO. But with the recent Vasilevskiy injuries we'll get into later on, and the cap flexibility that will provide, I'm sure they'll find a way to come to terms with Austin Watson here.
On the defensive side for the Tampa Bay Lightning, you're looking at quite the different core than what was there for the many of the Cup aspiring years. You've got guys like Kevin Shattenkirk, Ryan McDonough, among others, not in this lineup right now, and it seems to be a little bleak at this point with players like Nick Perbix on the top pair. You start with Victor Hedman. This is the absolute star for the team. He's aging a bit, but he's still doing all right for his age. I expect him to be another point-producing, offensive-minded defenseman with his agility still there this year, despite getting up there. Him alongside Nick Perbix should be good for a split of the defense. Otherwise, I don't know who you put Victor Hedman with, because Eric Chernak needs to be with someone like Mikhail Sergachev to protect Sergachev, because Sergachev is quite the high-risk defenseman. He makes a lot of high-risk plays. He looks for the high reward, sometimes fails, sometimes succeeds. So Eric Chernak being on his right side there is very helpful for Mikhail Sergachev. And then the third pair, you've got two veterans, Calvin DeHaan and Zach Bogosian, as well as some extras, including Darren Radish, the former AHL top scoring defenseman last year, as well as Hayden Fleury, who was once picked in the Seattle draft and was once a top prospect for the Carolina Hurricanes. So I look to see either of them compete for lineup spots. As you can see there, it is kind of wide open there on the third pair, as well as alongside Victor Hedman.
This is going to be an interesting year for the Tampa Bay Lightning, at least at the start, in terms of goaltending. So you have Vasilevskiy, who's been one of the best goalies in the league for a while now, with an injury going through surgery. We'll talk a bit about him later. So what remains after Vasilevskiy can't start? We have Jonas Johansson and Matt Tompkins looking as the projected starters on opening day. Jonas Johansson will probably take that role. And we'll just see what we'll talk about this later in our storyline segment, but it's a big question in net for the Lightning here.
Moving on to the storylines here, as Noel said, the biggest one really is the Andrei Vasilevskiy injury. This just came out uh, 4 or 5 days ago. So all the talk in Tampa is now about Andrei Vasilevskiy and whether they're going to replace him or how they can even try to replace him. He's going to be out for 8 to 10 weeks. And family friend of mine who's a doctor said that that's really optimistic for the injury and surgery that he has. It's a very serious back injury, I believe some sort of herniated disc or something to that effect. So very, very serious injury. It's really unfortunate they uh, didn't realize it needed surgery earlier on in the off season. But at the end of the day, this is the situation they're in now. So the current in-house options that they have, as Noel said, are Jonas Johansson. This is a goaltender who has career stats of 887 save percentage and 3.23 goals against in 35 NHL games. So really not a veteran by any means. And Matt Tompkins currently has no NHL experience. And he put up a 911 and a 253 in the SHL last year. So all right statistics, but in a much worse league. So it's really going to be interesting to see whether they roll with what they have or they go after some possible replacements. So some of the guys that could be replacements here via waivers are Martin Jones from the Toronto Maple Leafs, Alex Lyon from the Detroit Red Wings, Anthony Stolarz from the Florida Panthers. If they go the free agent route, they're probably looking at Yaroslav Halak, maybe a return of Brian Elliott, but he seems to be on his last leg, so that seems a little unlikely. Or if they go the trade route, they're looking at guys like Dan Vladar in Calgary or possibly Eric Comrie in Buffalo. Uh, any of those guys stick out to you?
So the first thing I want to bring up is I wonder if this was mismanagement from the Lightning medical staff because like it seems it doesn't really make sense if they knew there was something wrong with him to like go through the surgery just before the start of the season. Or I'm wondering if maybe something happened in training camp where it became a lot more serious and it became evident that he needed surgery. So I'm sure we'll find out more on that later. More details will be released. In terms of his replacement, from waivers, I like Martin Jones and Alex Lyon. I think those are two very solid options for the Lightning here. And I mean, waiver seems to make the most sense. It won't cost them anything, and Vasilevsky is going to make a return. So at some point, it doesn't. We're not exactly sure when. So getting someone essentially for free would make sense to back up Vasilevsky later. If they do go down the trade route, I do really like Dan Vladar. We talked in our Calgary video how they kind of have too many cooks in the kitchen. So they could potentially get him for cheap. I know he has a $2 million cap hit, so that may kind of deter the Lightning a bit. But I do really like Dan Vladar. I think he's a solid backup.
Yeah, and I'm in the same boat there. When it comes to waivers, I'm really curious to see how the next couple weeks go. If you follow Twitter closely during the waiver season that it is right now, as players are getting sent down to the AHL, or the attempt to get sent down to the AHL for the start of the 2023-2024 AHL season and their respective training camps, there's going to be a lot of players and goalies on these waiver options. So teams are going to have a lot of abilities to claim certain guys. We just saw players like Samuel Fagemo get claimed, Lassie Thompson get claimed. These are quality players.
Spencer Martin in net too.
Spencer Martin in it as well. So I'm curious to see what the goaltending situation looks like for every team because, as you know, you can only carry a 23-man roster. And so whether you want to choose to carry 3 or 2 goalies is up to the team, of course. But that'll be very interesting to see which teams decide to go with the 2 goalies and try to sneak a goalie down to the AHL through waivers, like you've mentioned with Martin Jones. That is potential for him to sort of get, snuck down there. But if he doesn't get snuck down there, he probably comes to Tampa Bay. I do think waivers is a simple situation because you have to wait a couple weeks now before the season starts anyways. We're about 9 to 10 days away, so I'd argue that just give it a few days, see which teams give up on their goaltenders and try to push them through waivers, and then take your pick of the litter. At the same time, I do think a more proactive strategy would be to go after someone like Dan Vladar. This is a goaltender who has been in trade rumors for many days and months at this point. through with the Calgary Flames because of the emergence of Dustin Wolf in recent years. So the tandem of Markstrom and Dustin Wolf, or at least the starting job for Markstrom and the Wolf progression, should be what the Calgary Flames are looking forward to this season, making Dan Vladar an extra. He's making 2.2 for the next 2 seasons. So even if there's a third team in the mix, possibly for retention, I doubt it. But there might be a way for the Tampa Bay Lightning to make this work. As we know, the Tampa Bay Lightning for many, many years have been in pretty much just over the cap with multiple provisions being used to make sure that they can still be cap compliant. So I'm very curious to see how they deal with this goalie situation, but by no means is there one definitive answer.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, just to kind of address what we said at the beginning, I think what happened was they were trying to address this without surgery initially. I think I heard
Mhm.
something about injections or something like that, but they really didn't want to do a surgery because obviously that is such a longer timetable. And then by the time the preseason came around, Vasilevskiy just did not feel right, and it was just not at a place where he was going to be able to go into the season. So they had to go the surgery route, unfortunately, and it's really sad from the perspective of a guy like Julien Brisebois because he didn't have the entire offseason to plan for this. He figured that Vasilevskiy was going to be there. To me, I think the guy that's getting the most buzz right now is Martin Jones, but to me, that's simply because he's in Toronto, and he's a very viable option. But to me, I think the best option for Tampa is probably Alex Lyon. And this is a guy who got the Florida Panthers into the playoffs last year. He's currently signed to a 2-year deal at $900,000. So they'd actually be getting their backup probably for the next 2 years. So I think this is a move that in 32 Thoughts today, I heard that Detroit's very afraid of the fact that if they send him down, Tampa's going to claim him right away. So I think they might be looking for to trade him somehow. But to me, I think Dan Vladar would be an unreal guy, but I just don't see it as realistic at this point because of his cap hit and the fact that Calgary's going to want probably upwards of a third round pick for this guy because he does have value in the NHL. And I don't know if Tampa is in a position to get rid of any more of their draft capital at this point. So to me, I really like Alex Lyon as the guy, and then probably Martin Jones or Yaroslav Halak as other options via waivers or free agent.
It
Yeah,
sounds like they took a gamble and just didn't pay off with Vasilevskiy here, which will make the
Yeah.
Atlantic so much more interesting this year.
yeah, absolutely. And one more piece to Alex Line. Yeah, we're obviously predicting based on who we think is going to fall to waivers, what teams are going to do before the season. But there is still that uncertainty where all of these guys that we're mentioning could just stick with their NHL clubs, and we could have no options for the Tampa Bay Lightning besides the trade route. It could come down to that. Teams now know the Tampa Bay Lightning are pretty much desperate, and they have no. They basically shown their hand. They say we have no goaltenders left in our system. We need a starting goalie. We need something in net to take care of the next couple of months. So there's really all the leverage is pretty much in the hands of those teams like the Detroit Red Wings who can choose what to do with Alex Lyon. They could mark up that price to be a sixth rounder potentially or a fifth rounder if they can negotiate that because of the need that Tampa Bay has right now.
Yeah, the thing to me is just the term with Lyon because not only are you getting him as backup this year, but you're getting him as a backup next year. And I think he'd be a really solid backup behind Vasilevskiy as we saw in his time in Florida. So that's the most interesting one to me. And just the last point here I'll make is I think Yaroslav Halak is a guy who was honestly rumored to be going to Tampa before any of this broke out. So I wonder if there's still talks going on there. And that's probably a pretty realistic option as well. He's definitely a better free agent option than Brian Elliott at this point. But it's a very unfortunate situation, and hopefully Tampa's able to kind of react as best they can in a short amount of time. Brisebois is obviously a great general manager, and we'll see how he reacts. It'll be very interesting to see in the next couple days. I would assume something's going to happen. Moving on to our next storyline, kind of the bad news is piling up for Tampa at this point, really, with Vasilevskiy and now Steven Stamkos extension drama. This is something that uh, I didn't foresee coming at the start of the season for sure. So essentially, what Stamkos said, paraphrasing, is that he was upset by the lack of talks around his extension in the offseason. And he said it publicly, which for a guy who's normally as keeps to himself in terms of private stuff or whatever, as much as Stamkos, very calculating what he says. you know that he's trying to get a message across to management that he wants to be in Tampa and he wants to get this contract done as soon as possible. But what was really interesting to me was not so much what Stamkos said, but what Brisebois said after that, where he essentially said that we need to collect more information throughout the course of this season, which from one perspective you can understand as you need to see how Stamkos is going to perform as he's getting up there in age and see how much you can offer him of the valuable cap space and limited cap space that Tampa has. But from another perspective, this is a guy who's been with the team for 15 years. He's been your captain for two Stanley Cups. You should really know what you have with him at this point. And I think that's why Steven Stamkos is really kind of getting upset with management at this point, and it's very understandable from his perspective as well.
Yeah, I think another reason that Stamkos may be so irked is that we saw Tampa last offseason or two offseasons ago sign a bunch of players to
Yeah.
long-term contracts. They locked up their core for a long time, and those contracts were a season before that their contracts even expired. So to leave Stamkos to the last minute like this, your captain really doesn't send a good message to the player. And I really like seeing, I mean, it's not your favorite team, of course, so you really like seeing this drama in the NHL. So more power to the player to speak out like this. And I think it really forces Tampa's hand. And we'll see what they end up doing with this situation and how it plays out.
Yeah, with the fact that he has been eligible since early this year to be signed for his next contract with the 1 year remaining is the sort of the kicker in all of this, that this is a guy that has been around for forever. There is very little sign of loyalty in pro sports. There is very little sign of people staying with the same team at all for any reason, of that matter. But the fact that he is the captain, he is the long-standing Tampa Bay Lightning member that has been through all of it with this team over the past 15, 16 years is something that is kind of disappointing to see that the management is not going to take that and figure it out right away before this season. Because as we know, the start of the season has been rocky for the Tampa Bay Lightning so far with their goaltending situation, as well as some other key points. But Stamkos having this other extension drama brings it all to a halt. It's like, wow, Tampa Bay Lightning are actually kind of screwed to start the season right now. They are
Yeah.
puzzled. They are confused. They aren't really ready to start the hockey games. They are more so distracted by all of this off-ice stuff, which is something that you don't usually see with teams like the Tampa Bay Lightning. This could happen in a bigger market like the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Montreal Canadiens, the Edmonton Oilers. There's always some sort of buzz, some sort of propaganda or other news that is going to affect that team to start the season, whether that be past success or failures. But the Tampa Bay Lightning seem to have a lot going for them with the most recent Cup wins and everything like that. So I'm confused, and I'm a bit surprised to see all of this happening at once and sort of, breaking down the Tampa Bay Lightning glory.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you said, Noel, with all the guys being locked up long term outside of Stamkos is a fantastic point, especially a guy like Hedman who's almost exactly the same age as Stamkos and is still locked up pretty long term. It's got to kind of be insulting to Stamkos. And something that's really interesting to me as well here is the fact that he's currently sitting at I believe, a cap hit of $8.5 million, something in that range.
8.5.
$8.5 million. I don't think he's going to be asking for more than that. And you have a projected cap increase of $4 million going into next offseason. That would leave you around $12 million to get this guy signed. So I really wonder what the hitch is in the negotiations here. I mean, I guess there hasn't even been any negotiations, but you'd think this is a guy who, at this point in his career, would take a bit of a hometown discount to stay in Tampa.
And he's not even a bad player. Like 2 seasons
No.
ago, he posted a 100-point season. Last year was around a point per game, solid defensively, and a true leader on the ice. So I don't really know what's going on behind the scenes here with Brisebois and the whole Stamkos drama, but they really got to figure it out.
A couple key factors that I can add to this are the young contracts that they did dole out. Brandon Hagel is going to be making $5 million more next year than he was this year. Anthony Cirelli is making 6.25 now, which you kind of forget in the sort of the grand scheme of things. And Mikhail Sergachev has signed that long-term deal this offseason. You've also got Victor Hedman. He's got 2 years left at 7.875, but you don't know what's happening with him either. And also, you've got pretty much all your team locked up next year. Very few UFAs besides Stamkos, but just some peripheral sort of perimeter players. So I'm very curious to see what happens with Stamkos, but overall, I think it's a pretty smart by Brisebois, despite being sort of the unfavorable option to wait this out. Wait until the end of the season. Wait what happens with your team itself as a whole. if you guys are not contending, that'll be a very, very crazy decision to make in February, closer to the deadline, what happens with Steven Stamkos. But I just think it's going to be a Lightning for life no matter what, no matter how much turmoil there is from now until the end of next offseason.
I don't disagree that it's smart to wait to pull the trigger on a contract, but what I don't think is smart is not talking to him at all and trying to figure out what his number is and what you have to work with. Because I think that's what Stamkos is so upset about is the fact that there's no dialogue at all. And that's really to me is insulting to a guy like this. So uh, to me, if I was Brisebois, if Stamkos was willing to sign a deal under 3 years, under $6 million, I'd sign that in a heartbeat, to be honest. I think he's going to remain a productive player for that amount of time. And that if you get him under $6 million, then it would be a great value contract. So if I'm Brisebois, I'd definitely be gauging what his numbers are and what term he's looking for right now and trying to work it into our team as opposed to kind of just not really considering it all right now. So guess that's one thing there. But in terms of uh, teams that have been rumored for Stamkos, if things do fall through with Tampa, there's always going to be the rumors of Toronto because he's a Markham native. So we'll have to see. Obviously, that didn't pan out to be true at all the first time round. So probably nothing to it this time. And some writers are already speculating teams like New York could be interested in him. But at the end of the day, any contender is going to be interested in this guy if he hits free agency and they're able to fit him in under their cap situation. So really, he'd make sense for any contending team. You can think about Colorado or Vegas or any of those teams. But only time will tell. At the end of the day, I think Stamkos and management probably want him to finish his career there. I guess they'll just have to wait and see whether it makes sense from a financial perspective. Moving on to our final storyline here, just kind of an open discussion as to whether the Tampa Bay Lightning should still be considered legitimate contenders in the NHL at this point. This is a team that went to three straight Stanley Cup finals, winning the first two of those three appearances. Last year, though, they were ousted by the Toronto Maple Leafs in the first round. So obviously, that doesn't really bode well for the team. Vasilevskiy looked shaky in that series, and now he's injured. There's turmoil with Stamkos, as we just went into at length. So it's really a team that is in a much weaker position than they're used to, especially after losing a guy like Alex Killorn from this team, as well as Ryan McDonagh. Like, they've lost a lot of key contributors from those Stanley Cup teams. So I think it's fair to question whether or not they're still a legitimate contender this year.
For me, I think the challenge with the Tampa Bay Lightning comes with making the playoffs. We know what they can do when they get there. They have the experience. They have Vasilevskiy. You mentioned he was shaky last year, but I still have faith in him. He's one of the best goalies in the league. But the start of the year for this team is going to be rough. With no options in net as of now, they may address that. And so this off ice drama we were talking about with Steven Stamkos, I have a feeling they aren't going to be starting off too hot. But if Vasilevskiy comes back and they get some wind in their sails going into the playoffs, I definitely think they're still a contender. That first round exit last season to the Toronto Maple Leafs, they did look like the better team throughout the most of the series. They had some overtime losses there, and they still have pretty much their whole core. And this is a championship winning core. So if they make the playoffs with momentum, I definitely think they're still a contender.
Yeah, and I just remember this team in 2019 losing that devastating first round to the Columbus Blue Jackets despite putting up 62 wins as in the regular season, and in recent years winning very different amounts of games, but still being such a chaotic playoff team. I'm curious to see in the future what happens with this core because the identity of the team centers around Nikita Kucherov and him kind of alone. Despite what many people may think about Braden Point, Steven Stamkos, and the quality of the rest of the team, Nikita Kucherov is the premier option on this team. He's paid the most money to be the premier option on this team, and I'm really curious to see if he can continue his outrageous performance to keep this team sort of being that elite threat against other teams, because as we've seen, the defense has gotten a lot weaker, and now the goaltending is completely out the door. So if the offense is going to be through anybody, it's going to be through Nikita Kucherov, especially on the power play.
Yeah. To me, this is a team that I'll never count out. Seen them many times in the playoffs. This is a team that I have no doubt they'll be fine this season. They'll weather the storm. Uh, Obviously, everything's going to ride on the health of Andrei Vasilevskiy. So hopefully they don't rush him back and they take their time there because um, as long as he comes back in time for the playoffs, I think even without him, this team's good enough to make the playoffs despite their questions in net. I think they'll be able to address that. So to me, I don't know if I'd consider them favorites, but I think contenders is definitely still within the realm of possibility. And to me, I'd actually argue to me that X factor is a guy like Braden Point because Kucherov, you're right, has been the driver of this team, but at the end of the day, he's getting up there in age, and I think he's kind of got to pass the torch at some point. And I think the guy who he's going to be passing it to is Braden Point. This is a guy who put up, what was it, 40 goals last year, or maybe even more than that. And as long as Braden Point can stay healthy, I think this is a guy who, in a year or two, we will be looking at as the best forward, maybe even the best player on this team. So I'd really like to see him continue on his trajectory this season.
Yeah, they also have John Cooper, one of the premier coaches in the league, so can't really count out good coaching as well.
And Sergachev is emerging as one of the top defenders in the NHL as well.
They're
This is
still
a
really
team.
good.
Oh yeah,
That's the point I'm trying to make.
this is a team that is organically transitioned into a new core with still the great guys that they had to begin with. So definitely not going to count them out. I think they're still contenders in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a lot of sunshine and roses ahead, despite all of the drama that we're experiencing right
Yeah.
now.
Moving on to our final segment here, just an overview of the offseason and the upcoming season for the Tampa Bay Lightning. The offseason grade, we're going to go with an A. It's unfortunate to lose guys like Corey Perry, Alex Kalorin, some guys who were really impactful for this team at different moments. But at the end of the day, I think they did a great job bringing in guys who are impactful in their roles. Connor Sheary is going to provide offense in that top nine. Tyler Mott, to me, is one of the best guys in his role. The key word Noel brought up is energy. I think he's a great energy player. He's a great forechecker, a really good signing there. Glenn Denning, at the end of the day, you know what you're getting with him. You're not getting him for the points. So all these guys are going to come in. And another guy that's underrated to me, sorry, is Calvin DeHaan. I really like him as a defender and a penalty killer. So I think they made some really interesting additions around the fringes. It'll remain to be seen how they address the Andrei Vasilevskiy injury, but given their cap constraints, I think they did an incredible job this offseason, also retaining Tanner Jeannot as well. So it's going to be an A. In terms of the offensive strength, it's going to be an A as well. This is a team that still has Kucherov, Point, Stamkos, all those guys, so can't be anything less than that. In terms of defensive strength, it's going to be an A, and this really stems from the left side of this team with Sergachev and Hedman, but they also have Cernak on the right side. So some really great defensive depth throughout their lineup, even though there's some guys who are maybe playing a bit above their weight. As for the goaltending, we have an A plus with an asterisk. Obviously, the injury to Andrei Vasilevskiy is what that asterisk is. If he comes back and he's at full health, this is the best goaltender in the NHL, in my opinion. And so that's why they get the A plus. But obviously, asterisk is completely dependent on his health. In terms of the future outlook, going to be a B minus. This is a team that has some exciting players who aren't too old, like Sergachev and Point, but they're pretty much devoid of prospects and really young players and picks. So definitely going to get downgraded a little bit there.
And just something to note, we made these standings before the Vasilevsky injury news came out, or the surgery rather. So we have them placed second in the Atlantic Division in our Eastern Conference standings, and I still think that's fairly reasonable for this team. We've seen the Tampa Bay Lightning in recent years kind of coast through the regular season with the aim of like saving their energy for the more meaningful playoff games. So I definitely think they may be in for a bit more of a challenge this year with the injury to Vasilevsky and some other factors going on with this team. That being said, I think second in the Atlantic is still a reasonable place to place them.
Looking at our final graphic of the individual rankings for the Tampa Bay Lightning, Nick had them finishing seventh in the NHL, Mo had them finishing eighth, and I had them finishing seventh as well. So an aggregate ranking of seventh and a firm hold on a playoff spot there. As Noel said, this was before the Andrei Vasilevskiy injury. But at the end of the day, this is a team that, regardless of the Vasilevskiy injury, I cannot see them missing the playoffs. At the end of the day, even though through all those playoff runs, the one constant has been Vasilevskiy, I still think they're going to be able to weather the storm. That'll wrap it up for today's video. So thank you guys so much for watching. We hope to see you guys back in the next one. And please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.